Hello and welcome to the Space Combat Guide for Stellaris. If you are a brand new Stellaris player, you have likely been using the auto-generated ship designs. Maybe you moused over one of the components and saw all these numbers. Then there are more numbers over here and it can get a bit overwhelming. Now, if you are a first-time player, you can just keep using these pre-built ships if you want. You might still win most of the battles if you have superior numbers and tech, but your ship designs won't be ideal because combat in Stellaris is all about countering the enemy ship build. We talked about it a little bit in my weapons guide. If you haven't seen that one, take a look. It will explain some key points on what weapons counter armor and shields. Link in description. If you have seen the weapons video, or if you already know about the counters for weapons and shields and armors, it's time to get into some more combat details. Let me start by saying that this video is the result of me just being curious on how combat works in Stellaris. You don't necessarily need to know every little detail, and you can play the game if you just understand the basic weapons choice. But anyone who has dabbled long enough in Paradox games will know that's not enough for us Paradox fans. We need to know how stuff works in these super complicated games we love. So, we'll start in a sandbox mode. We have our corvette with some weapons and some shield and armor, and we have an enemy corvette. To understand how space warfare works in Stellaris, we will go through each phase of combat. First, our ships need to get close enough to the enemy ship to engage in combat. This is determined by speed and weapon range. The sublight speed is how fast the ship travels in the star system. You always want to make your ships faster as you want to get to the weapons range as fast as possible. Weapon range is stated here. This small mass driver has a range of 50. That's the maximum distance it can shoot the enemy from. So if you have only weapons with low range, you will want more speed so you can get to the enemy forces faster. The engagement range and weapons range are slightly different. Engagement range is where fleets are locked in combat, while weapons range is where the weapons start to fire. So our corvette is locked in combat now, and it's time for weapons to light up the enemy ship. This is where most of the numbers we see on this screen are going to be used. There are three main things we will look at. What are the chances of our weapons to hit the enemy ship? How much damage is it going to do? And how many times you can shoot at the enemy ship? The first one, chance to hit, is a simple formula. It has accuracy, evasion, and tracking. You must have heard that evasion is a good modifier to have, and you will want to max this out on your corvettes. Evasion caps at 90 and it does exactly what it says. The more evasion your ship has, the less likely it will get hit. Evasion can be countered by tracking. Tracking is something you will want to keep high on your backline ships, the one with decently big guns, especially if the enemy ships have high evasion. Tracking only negates evasion though, so having more tracking than enemy ships' evasion doesn't do anything. This evasion minus tracking, we'll call it effective evasion, is then subtracted from the accuracy of the weapons. Accuracy also has a cap of 100. There's often questions about the difference between accuracy and tracking. Best way to understand it is that tracking only negates evasion. If you are fighting a swarm of corvettes or ships with high evasion, you need more tracking. But if you are only fighting big ships with little or no evasion, getting more tracking is not going to help you at all. There's a direct chance to hit modifier as well. Auxiliary fire control directly adds +5 to the chance to hit, so stacking this is always a good idea, especially in your big long range ships. Alright, now that we have fired the weapon, how does it actually do damage? Our mass driver has a damage range of 5 to 16, and this is where the classic Paradox RNG dice roll comes in. Every weapon has a damage range. However, you can also see the average damage. So each time the weapon fires, it can do a damage of anywhere between 5 to 16. But in a long fought battle, the damage will average out eventually. So the RNG factor isn't that big, at least compared to some other Paradox games. Now that the game has decided what damage roll your weapons get, it will calculate how the damage applies to the enemy ship. Ships have 3 layers of hit points basically. The hull, which is the life HP bar, and when it goes to 0, the ship is destroyed. There's the armor and there's the shields. You can equip armor and shields on your ship while designing, and we have already talked about how they fare against different types of weapons in the earlier video. Getting back to damage, the game calculates the damage first on shields. When they go down to 0, damage is then applied to armor, and only when armor goes to 0, hull damage is calculated. So for this mass driver, it will first damage enemy ship shields and whittle them down, then slowly work on armor and then the hull. There are weapons that can bypass armor or shields, which is labeled as armor or shield penetration in game. They will hit the hull points directly, and when the hull reaches 0, the ship will get destroyed. It doesn't matter how much shield or armor it has left. The last part about how the damage is dealt is how fast the weapon can fire the next shot. It's the firing rate, stated here as cooldown time. Any modifiers you get to the ship fire rate get applied here. The game also gives you an average damage per day number, which is actually fairly useful. If you don't want to go to ship design again and again to counter enemy ships, just look for weapons that do more damage per day and you will fare better. What we have talked about so far mostly applies to kinetic and energy weapons, and we have already talked about their effectiveness against armor and shield in the last video. The guided weapons and strike crafts work slightly differently. Guided weapons are missiles and torpedoes. If you just look at the average damage per day stat, it is substantially higher than a small kinetic or energy weapon. Another thing to note here is that guided weapons have 100% shield penetration, which means they ignore shield HP and do damage to armor and then to hull. So you're taking one whole HP bar before the fight even begins. All this sounds like guided weapons are overpowered, and so naturally there is a catch. Guided weapons can be countered by point defense modules, and individual missiles have additional stats here. They have hull points, evasion, and speed, so they take some time to reach the enemy ship, and if the enemy ship has a point defense system, the guided missiles are going to get demolished mid-flight and deal 0 damage, which is a big problem if you have a missiles only fleet and the enemy comes with a PD fleet. Like all other weapons type, you need to look at enemy fleet designs and design your ships accordingly. Another stat is the retargeting range that we see here. This comes in use when the original target for the missile is destroyed by some other means before the missile reaches it, in which case the missile will retarget another enemy ship if there are any in the retargeting range. Next, strike crafts are modules you can put in your hangar bay. These are small planes that come out of the hangars during combat and deal damage. Just like guided weapons, strike crafts also have fairly high average damage per day, and they ignore shields while dealing damage. They also have their own stats and hull points, shields, tracking, evasion, and speed. A hangar will deploy 8 strike crafts at a time, and if a strike craft is destroyed, it will be redeployed by the hangar after a few days. Strike crafts themselves also act as point defense systems, in that they will counter the incoming missiles and enemy strike crafts. So all in all, strike crafts are pretty valuable to have. People have done some testing on it, and it appears that they fare better against more static enemies than mobile ones. So using strike crafts against defense platforms is great, while against corvettes they are not as useful. The point defense systems PD and flak guns counter enemy guided weapons, missiles, and torpedoes and strike crafts. Flak guns are slightly better at countering strike crafts as they have higher tracking, but both PD and flak guns do basically the same thing. While we are on this screen, let's quickly cover the core components and utility components of a ship. First is the reactor, which generates power. You always need power in the positive when designing a ship, or the game won't let you save the ship design. Any extra power in the ship gets converted to the fire rate, evasion, and sublight speed for the ship. However, this is a tiny amount. 10% of extra power gives 1% fire rate, evasion, and sublight speed. Hyperdrives are how ships travel through hyperlanes. Higher tier hyperdrives means your ships travel faster between star systems, which is going to be very important around mid-game when you have a big empire and you need to shuttle your fleets around. There's also the jump drive, which will let you jump to another system without using hyperlanes, which is also very useful. However, keep in mind that once the jump drive is used, it cannot be used again for 200 days, and during this time, your ship will also have a debuff of minus 50% sublight speed and weapon damage. Thrusters are the ship engines. Higher level thrusters will mean more sublight speed and more evasion, which are both super useful, obviously. Sensors will show enemy ships that are some hyperlane jumps away depending on their tier. Combat computers let you choose what you want the ship to do. They give some very nice flat bonuses. Typically you will use swarm tactics for the corvettes, picket tactics for destroyers, and artillery for the battleships who are going to sit behind and fire long-range weapons. The most important thing to consider when using the combat tactics is the range. Because if you're using carrier tactics on your battleships with weapons less than 150 range, those weapons won't do anything unless the enemy ship approaches the weapon range. So make sure you are assigning the right tactics to the right ships. Ships like Titan and Juggernauts also have auras you can assign them, which gives bonus to all ships in the fleet. They are fairly useful and self-explanatory. Utility components are your shields, armor, hull plating, and auxiliary modules. You should always have both shields and armor in your ship, unless you're fighting someone who only uses kinetic or energy weapons. Typically, AI ships will use a mix of both, and how much armor and shield you have will depend on whether AI is dealing more kinetic or energy damage, if you want to min-max that is, or you can just go 50-50 and pray for the best. One thing to remember is that shields generate slowly over time by themselves, while any damage to armor or hull will need to be repaired. Also, shields require power, while armor and hull plating do not. Auxiliary modules can be used for a lot of different things. Reactor booster gives you extra power for when the main reactor isn't enough. Shield capacitors give extra shield points. Afterburners give more speed and evasion, so they are super important in your frontline ships to get to that 90 evasion cap. Auxiliary fire control gives +5 chance to hit, and you should put it in your ships whenever possible. We'll wrap up this video with a couple of very important mechanics that are often overlooked. First is the ship disengagement chance. Basically, when any ship's hull points reach below 50%, the ship has a chance to disengage from the battle. This ship will show this flag icon and not participate in the fight and will not take any damage. Here is the formula for disengagement chance. The mechanic is really important to keep in mind because if you're losing a fight, this disengagement will allow you to gather up your fleet and fight again. Different ships have different modifiers for ship disengagement, and there are additional modifiers you can get for it. My advice is to stack this modifier always, as it will help you lose less ships. At the same time, you would want to destroy enemy ships before they have a chance to disengage. The starbase building is helpful here, and so is the Titan aura, and it's also one of the reasons why you should use more large weapons on your backline ships. These weapons that can one-shot a ship and just obliterate it, which means the enemy suffers more losses and they don't have a chance to regroup and fight again. The other important mechanic to remember is the emergency retreat button. Use this anytime you encounter a superior enemy fleet. You can only retreat after 30 days of combat though, which can be increased further by some modifiers. Keep in mind though that when the ship retreats, it has a 10% chance to take 20% damage to the hull. And if the ship is below 20% hull points, it has a 50% chance to get destroyed during emergency retreat. This can also be modified by doctrines and admiral traits. There are a couple of additional hidden mechanics you might not know about. Force disparities, where a smaller fleet will get increased fire rate when fighting a larger fleet. This scales linearly with fleet size difference. The bigger fleet will obviously still win the fight unless they are really technologically inferior. And finally, hull points also affect the fire rate of a ship. As a ship loses hull points, its fire rate is reduced proportionately. This isn't something you can use when planning a battle really, but it is one of the space combat mechanic in game. And that is all there is to know about how space combat works in Stellaris. This video is meant more for beginners like myself who are curious how combat works in this game, and so I decided to not include some specific modules you get from events or from things like Devouring Swarm that gives additional modifiers to some combat mechanics. But overall, this video should give you an idea on how space combat works. Now, for those of you who are expecting to hear about fleet compositions and how to make an ideal ship design, this video isn't it. I might make a separate video on it, but the quick answer to your question is that the ideal fleet composition will always depend on who you are fighting. I hope the last video on weapons and this video on combat answered some of your burning questions. If you have any more questions or feedback, please feel free to leave a comment below. I always love hearing from you all. You are watching a Radio Res Guide. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you all in the next one.